I feel like I need to start out, though, with somewhat of a disclaimer. The Gospel of John John did not give us 7 signs in the Gospel. This is a division that we've created, and I don't have a problem with it, although sometimes we think, well, the Gospel of John, he gave us 7 signs. Well, the word semeion, which is translated into the English sign, actually occurs 20 times in the Gospel, and so you could say that you got sign in other places in the Gospel, and that would be correct. But you might say, but I thought he said this was the first sign and this was the second sign, and you'd be right about that. He does call the first sign, the water to wine, in John chapter 2, the first sign, and then later on he talks about this being the second sign, the healing of the nobleman's son. But the thing about that is, when he came into Cana of Galilee, John is telling us that was the first one that he did up north. That was the second one he did up north. But you'll notice if you look at the last part of chapter 2, that Jesus came down into Judea and he did a bunch of miracles down there. And so those were signs. And so you can't accurately say that was the second sign that he did total, because that's not true. It's the second sign that he did in Cana of Galilee. Another thing, too, about that is, you might say, why would Mary think that Jesus could do anything about the problem of the wine shortage? Or why did anybody have any reputation, any knowledge of the reputation of Jesus when he did come back? Well, it would be because of some of the things that he had already done in Judea. And you know, even in the ancient world, that news could spread fast. And so there would be things that would be happening as far as signs are concerned. So anyway, don't think that John actually divides up his book into 7 signs. But we're certainly going to look at 7 signs. And by the way, if you've ever done any research on this, you probably have noticed that they don't even agree on what the 7 signs are. So you've got some people that say, well, it was this 7, and some say it was that 7, and so on. So it does get a little bit convoluted there. Signs. We live in a world of signs, and sometimes you look at signs and it's like a real head scratcher. What on earth is the sign trying to communicate? Now, I've already looked at this slide like a dozen times, and I still have no idea what this sign is trying to communicate. And those of you that are back there, you're saying, does he have a slide up? I don't even know what you can't see the sign from back there. Clear as mud, right? If I came up on that one on the left, I think you just curl up and just stay right there. What are you supposed to do exactly? And then the right lane must right left. But that must have been a military guy that made that one. I'm not sure what's going on with that. We live in a world that has lots of signs. And I was thinking about that as I'm driving through Oklahoma City. And because I was doing this lesson, I was thinking about the number of signs that we have in our world. And as I'm driving through the city, all of the signs, I mean, you've got exit signs and street signs and advertising signs. And I was actually stunned that you had some construction signs. I thought all of those were in Denver, in the whole world. But you've actually got some. I was so happy to know that Denver's not the only place that's got construction signs. We're inundated with signs. We live in a world of signs. And, well, the ancient world had signs too. And John is playing off of this idea of signs. And being in a world of signs is something that is really a part of our life. Now, is there anybody here that has ever blown through a stop sign that you didn't mean to? Okay, we've got the policeman there. Please keep your hands up. No, I'm just kidding. Stuff like that happens. And it's like, well, if you're married, your wife always saw the sign. You realize you just went through a stop sign. It's like, no, I would have stopped if I had known there was a stop sign there. But you don't want to go through a stop sign. The sign is there because of a reason and a warning and a danger. And so when we see signs, we know that it's really not the sign, but it's the meaning behind the sign. Now, I suspect there's not a person in here this afternoon that has looked at a stop sign and said, I just love that octagon shape. And the colors, I love the red and black that they choose. The combination. Please tell me you've never done that. No, it's not the sign, it's the message of the sign. And so we look at the sign, but we get the message behind the sign. That's really what this is all about. And so as we go through the Gospel of John, this is typically what people name as the 7 signs. And a lot of them have it like this. And, you know, I found it curious that on this particular guy and several others like it, they switched the order of the signs in chapter 6, where they've got Jesus walking on water first and then feeding the multitude second. And part of the reason for that is because they see a chiasm. You know what a chiasm is? Where you've got the first one and the last one have parallels, and the second and the sixth one have parallels, and then they kind of come in together, and the most important one would be the one in the very middle. Well, apparently they wanted the one to be in the very middle, Jesus walking on the water, and so they made that the middle of the chiasm. But anyway, these are some things that men have done. But here are the 7 signs. Let's talk about these signs. I wish that we had time to read through all of these 7 signs. Some of the texts are longer than others, and so I'm making an assumption that all of us here are very familiar with these accounts from the Gospel of John. We don't have time to read through them, and so I'm just going to briefly summarize, and then we'll talk about these things. The foundation, though, of this whole thing is a passage that if you've been in all of the lectures so far, I think just about all of the speakers have brought us to John 20, 30, and 31. When we think about doing exegetical work, is the idea of looking at clues that the inspired writer gives us as to what the book is all about. And one of the keys to exegesis is what I refer to as a purpose statement. Why are you writing this book? John tells us in chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, why he is writing the book. And this text ties in ever so directly to what it is that we're talking about here. And that is, he says that these signs, well, I don't know if Okay. Is it going to work? Oh. These signs are done so that you might believe. So one thing is clear, John is emphasizing signs, and these verses are the key to exegesis because they're giving us that purpose. And John is claiming that Jesus did many other signs. Now, if you're like me, I'd like to hear about every single one of those signs. I'd like to read about every single one. But we don't need any more. What has been given, what has been recorded, is sufficient. Sufficient to what end? John tells us to bring about belief. So, believe what? That Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. To what end? That you might have life. Could there possibly be a more important purpose or reason for a book? Because now we're not talking about you're having a good year, or really even you're having a good life. But now we're talking about forever and ever and ever. We're talking about something that extends into eternity, and therefore this is of utmost importance. All right, so the first one is water to wine. You're familiar with the account. Jesus has gone to a wedding ceremony that's in Cana of Galilee. Typically, it would start on a Wednesday. It would go 7 days. And the people that were getting married were responsible for taking care of all of the needs of the wedding guests that would come for 7 days. It appears as if Jesus and the 12 disciples were not expected. Maybe Jesus was, and the 12, I don't know about that. But one thing is clear, they run out of supplies. Mary comes to Jesus and says, can you help them out? Jesus then does this miracle. And he turns the water into wine. Now, according to our best guesstimates, he produced somewhere in the neighborhood of 180 gallons of wine. Now, one of the things that happens frequently in my world is I'll get a call from someone that will say, all right, Denny, the water to wine miracle, was it intoxicating or was it not? And without fail, I will respond with this. What is the purpose of that miracle? Have you noticed how quiet it got? Well, that's typically is how quiet it is on the other end of the phone. Because with few exceptions, they'll say, I guess I really don't know. And here is the problem. The problem is that we have run to a particular issue that's a part of the miracle, and we fail to see the sign. We've blown it. We're so focused on intoxicating, non-intoxicating, that we don't really even know. And then I'll say, John tells us, by the way, what was the purpose of the sign? As a matter of fact, there are 3 purposes of the sign, according to John. He tells us that it was the first of his signs that he did in Cana of Galilee. All right, so there's some significance to the northern ministry of Jesus and how Jesus is going about establishing his reputation. And this was the beginning point. And so it had some significance because there can only be one first. And this was a pretty cool first of the signs that Jesus did. Second, he tells us that the purpose of this miracle was to manifest his glory. Now I want to come back to that one. The third reason he says that it brought about belief in the disciples. What did John 20, 30 and 31 say was the purpose of signs? To do what? To bring about belief. Well, guess what? The very first sign that Jesus does in Cana of Galilee accomplishes that goal. Now, as has been beautifully expressed in this weekend of lectures, belief is a growth process because we see the disciples being challenged to have more belief and greater faith and so on. So it is a work in progress for sure. But this was, John says, a starting point where they believed. What does this manifested his glory mean? You know, the glory of Jesus is one that really splits off into two different categories. One is the idea of his nature. The glory of the person, the quality of the person manifesting his glory as being the begotten of God. And what I mean by that is we're seeing something about Jesus's sensitivity. Because we got some very, very embarrassed wedding hosts. And they're in a tight spot. And did you know that there could be legal action taken against them? Yes. I think we're in a sue-happy society. Well, they could have sued people for running out of wine. But then when we think about manifesting his glory, a lot of times we go to that second part, and that's power. The power of Jesus. How long does it take if you had to start from scratch to make wine? I mean, you got to start out with some dirt, right? Some seed. And then it takes the process for the plant to grow large enough to produce the grapes, and then the process with the grapes, the making of the... I mean, you're talking about a long period of time. And Jesus did that instantly. Now, when it says the disciples believed in him, we would say that what the disciples did is successfully connected dots. And that's what I'd like for us to do right now. Connect the dots on what it would take to go from water to wine, and that whole process from dirt to product. That's pretty impressive. That was a sign that they got. They're going, wow, that's pretty impressive. Now, one of the things I was going to say in the top right of each of these slides is I've got a stop sign with the number so that we'll stop and make sure we don't miss the sign. We don't want to be guilty of the very thing that John is trying for his readers to avoid. We need to get the sign. All right, so the nobleman's son. Scholars are not united on whether this was a Gentile royal official or was a Jewish nobleman of some kind. I tend to think that he was a Gentile because typically the word that's used has to do with a royal official, and that's not the way the Jewish hierarchy was set up. But I also think of what John is doing in the various examples that he's giving, we talk about a high Jewish official in Nicodemus, a low Samaritan woman in John chapter 4, and now the nobleman. Would you go back to a high Jewish official, or would you go to maybe someone that isn't in the category of a Nicodemus or a Samaritan woman? Well, I tend to think it makes perfect sense that now you're going to move to a Gentile here. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But he comes to Jesus. He hears that Jesus is coming back into the area. And so he comes to Jesus and he says, look, my son is sick and is about to die. Now, what the text tells us is the son has a fever. You know, fevers were one of those things that the ancient world just was clueless on. Because there's nothing visible that's wrong. If you got a skin injury, you can do something about that. But what's up with a fever? What do you do about that? Well, you didn't know what to do about it. And so the person would just suffer. And then they would die. So the man is coming to Jesus and saying, I need help. Would you come and heal my son? Jesus tells the man, go, your son lives. And the text tells us that he believed and headed home. Now, let's note that there hasn't been a sign yet. Have you noticed that? There's no sign. He already believes. And he's on his way back home, and he gets greeted by the men saying, your boy's fine. Well, what time did he? The fever broke. He just instantly got well. 1 o'clock. Wow. That was exactly when Jesus said, your son's going to be fine. And then the text tells us, the father knew that it was at the same hour in which Jesus said to him, your son lives. And he himself believed, and his whole household. Now you say, wait, couldn't that have just been coincidence? Maybe his son was going to get well anyway. But notice the sign. The father did some research. The timing was too precise. It had to be Jesus. It had to be what he had done. And he believed. He believed that Jesus had the power to heal. That's why he went to him in the first place. He accepted the possibility that Jesus had the power to heal over distance. Where would he have gotten that? I have no idea. Because we don't know of any recorded miracle prior to this time that Jesus would have healed over distance. Where did he get that idea? Well, but he believed it. And then he believed that Jesus had the power to control the timing. What does this sign do for you? What is it saying to you and to me? Well, John would say, well, my hope is that you're looking at that and saying, Son of God. He's the Son of God. Because that's what John says is what he's hoping that we'll get from the signs. Sign number 3 is the lame man. Here's a guy that has been in this condition for 38 years. There may be some here that have been struggling with something that long. I can't even imagine what that would be like. But this is clearly a legitimate sickness. This is not something that he started getting sniffles last night and today here we are. This is something that has totally taken over his life 38 years. He's not faking this. And I don't know how many have grown up in the church. I did. And so these miracles of Jesus are something that I've heard of ever since I was little. So the whole idea is they're by the pool of Siloam. They've got 5 porches, of which there are a lot of sick people there. They're just looking for hope. And the idea was, when the water stirs, first one in gets well. Well, this guy is not going to be first one in because he doesn't have the physical capability of moving that fast. And he doesn't have anybody that's there to help him do it either, and so he's just stuck. But here's the question that as a kid always puzzled me. Jesus says, "Do you wish to be made well?" Now, we didn't use terminology like this when I was a kid, but today you'd go, duh. Right? No, I want to stay sick. But really, there are some people that become so comfortable with where they are that they don't want to change. They are going to stay and want to stay in whatever condition they're in. So it's possible, it's conceivable that maybe he really didn't want to. How bad do you want to get well? And so he tells Jesus he really does want to get well. So Jesus then goes ahead and he heals the lame man. And what's interesting about that is he tells him, take up your bed and walk. All right, let's do it again. Let's start connecting the dots. 38 years of no physical activity. What kind of muscles are you going to have? You're not going to have anything. You know, we think about that those who lift weights or exercise, that if you stop, that within 36 to 48 hours, your muscles start going through some process of atrophy. But 38 years of not doing anything with those muscles, you really don't have anything. And plus, and I'm the father of 3, as he said, and I've got 5 grandchildren, and I've had the blessing of watching all 8 of those learn to walk. Now, I don't know, maybe your grandkids are more coordinated than mine, but they didn't exactly get up and start sprinting. There were a few falls, wobbly. And here's a guy that Jesus is saying, take up your bed and walk. He hasn't walked in 38 years. And he does exactly that. So there's all of these amazing physical things that's taken place. We're going, who can do that? Who can say to a guy that's been 38 years in this condition, yeah, get up, walk? And he can, he does. What happened to that body? Oh, it's amazing. It's one of those Hollywood things where you see the transformation and all of a sudden, you know, these little bitty thin legs all of a sudden expand because now they've got muscles of a man that is maybe in his early 40s or something. Wow. That's impressive. But John said it was a Sabbath. Of all days, he had to do it on the Sabbath day. So there's our stop sign. What's up with this particular sign? When the lame man is now walking around and people know, they said to him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" So what's the point of the sign? It drives us to ask the most important question. Who is this guy? Who could just command, "Take up your bed and walk"? Well, one of the things that the gospel writers do, especially Matthew, is he loves to ask questions that are not sometimes answered at all. And sometimes a very abbreviated answer is given. And the reason they do that, it's a literary technique, is to get you to answer the question. So who's the man? Who is a guy that can make a statement like this, a man 38 years being in that condition, and he gets up and walks? Who can tell him to do that? Somebody that's got a lot of power. And now see, Nicodemus in chapter 3 was pretty good at connecting some dots. Because he said, "No one can do the things you do unless God be with him." Well, there you go. God is with Jesus. Yeah, but he did this on the Sabbath. Well, but if that was all that bad, God would have stopped him. So what's the purpose of this sign? To drive us to ask the question, answer that question. Sign number 4, the feeding of the 5,000. 5,000 men, John says, are there. Again, have you thought about the amount of food necessary to feed 5,000 men? Well, I did. Have you ever looked inside of a semi-truck trailer? You know how big they are. Well, to feed 5,000 men, you would need from front to back, top to bottom, 2.5 trucks of bread. And then, for fish, you would need one whole semi-truck absolutely packed full of fish. That's just for the men. If there were women and kids there, then start multiplying that. All right, so we go through the process. What does it take for fish to get to the point where we can eat them? Or for bread to be made? Again, dirt, seeds, time, rain, sunshine. And Jesus is doing it like that. Who can do that? What kind of man, what kind of power is able to do that? And so we stop and we say, those men, when they had seen the sign, said, "This is truly the prophet who is come into the world." I love the way John says this, and I believe it's totally on purpose. It doesn't say that they saw the miracle. It says they saw the sign. So the miracle led them to the sign that led them to say, "This is the prophet." The prophet likened to Moses, the prophet that the Old Testament said was coming. What do we expect beyond this guy? Sign number 5, Jesus walks on water. And there's more than one time during Jesus' ministry that he walks on water. Like in the Gospel of Matthew, you have both accounts being recorded at different times. The second of which was when Peter said, "Lord, bid me to come to you," and Jesus tells him to come on, and he does, and then he gets scared and sinks. But here Jesus is walking on water. The disciples see him walking on water. How do you do that? When you were a kid, did you ever try to walk on water? Well, if you did, it didn't work. I guarantee you went right down, just like I did. What does it take in order to defy the laws of nature, gravity, and all that and do this? But Jesus is doing it, and this is one of these signs that he's recording. But what's interesting about this is that Jesus says, don't be afraid. Now, if you're like me, you've looked at this miracle and maybe said, I'm not quite sure I know what he means by that. Does he mean that Jesus was a scary figure? Because we know that some of the synoptics say they thought it was a ghost and they cried out for fear. So maybe that's it. Or is there more to that? Fear of the unknown, fear of what's going on with Jesus and this ministry. When we talk again about exegesis, I always make the point that every Bible account is there for a reason. There's no wasted space. Even though John tells us there are many other signs that Jesus did that are not recorded, he's given us these. Why is he given us this one? And why is it given here in this particular text? Jesus just destroyed their whole vision of the strong-armed military warlord Messiah. He fed the 5,000 men. They were ready to make him king. All was exactly coming in to play like they had dreamed, and then Jesus slips away, and the disciples are going, what just happened? And I guarantee you, they were having doubts. They were afraid that maybe they had made a mistake. They had hitched their wagon to the wrong train here. And then you see Jesus walking on water. You start connecting some dots and you're saying, maybe we're going to stay with this guy a little bit longer. Who does that? Who can do that? Sign number 6, sight to the blind man. Blind from birth. And as we get into John chapter 9, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? So automatically there was a stigma to this guy. It's bad enough being blind, but then you've got all of this stigma on top of that, well, because of sin. Somebody sinned, he sinned, his parents sinned, but anyway, God zapped him for it, and now he's paying the price for sin. Jesus said, well, neither one of those. He's not blind because of sin. But then he goes on and he heals the blind man. Now, what we've done is we've said, okay, let's start thinking about behind the sign. What is it that happens when somebody is born blind? Somewhere in the womb, something went awry. I don't know exactly what. It could be a number of things, I suppose. But now we've got a grown man and a lifetime of blindness, and Jesus takes some clay and some spittle and puts it on the guy's eyes, and he tells him to go wash in the pool of Siloam, and he does, and he comes back seeing. What? That's way too easy. That was way too quick, way too simple. But that's what happens. So, stop sign. What happens? Later on, and I didn't realize our text was getting cut off there at the bottom. Jesus asked him the question, do you believe in the Son of God? Who is he, Lord? That I may believe in him. And Jesus said to him, you have both seen him, and it is he who is talking to you. Then he said, Lord, I believe. That was the whole point of the signs. And it certainly worked with him, but it's supposed to work with other people that are witnessing this. Sign number 7, the raising of Lazarus in John chapter 11. Jesus has gotten word that Lazarus is not doing well. He already knows he's going to die. He tells the disciples he's going to die. By the time he gets there in Bethany, Lazarus has been dead and buried for 4 days. The Jews believed that a spirit would hover over the body for a couple of days and then would depart. And when that would happen, there is zero chance of the person coming back to life. So Lazarus is good and dead, buried. He ain't coming back. Jesus cries out with a loud voice, not because when I was a kid I thought, was Lazarus hard of hearing too? Did he have to? It had nothing to do with that, but it's for everybody else that's there. Because the timing of this needs to be noted. Jesus screams for him to come forth, and guess what? Here he comes. What does it take physically in order to bring a dead body back to life? Jesus says to Mary, didn't I tell you? Didn't I give you a heads up on this already? That if you would believe, you would see the glory of God. Now, with the last two, those signs are also pointing us to some very important truths about Jesus. Well, actually, the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus said, I'm the bread of life. Then he backed it up. Jesus said, I'm the light of the world. And he backed it up by giving sight to a guy that was in darkness. Jesus said, I'm the resurrection of the life. And then he backed it up by raising up a guy. All right, we got to stop right here and make a point. And I want to invite you to go back to chapter 5. All right, so we're talking about the man that was lame, that was sick. Jesus told him to take up his pallet and walk, and he did. And the Jewish leaders are asking him questions. Who was it that did all this? And he told them that it was Jesus. And then notice verse 16. And for this reason, the Jews were persecuting Jesus because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. You want to talk about blowing past a stop sign? How about that verse? Where did these guys ever say, yeah, but? Yeah, he did it on the Sabbath, but he did it. He actually did it. We talked to the guy. It's a verifiable miracle that Jesus did. Yeah, but he did it on the Sabbath, right by the stop sign. Went right by. So what does it take for us? Water to wine, I'm all in. That convinces me. Healing of the nobleman's son, did it with just a command over time and space. The idea of a lame man getting up and walking, been in that condition for 38 years, feeding 5,000 men. Are those good enough for you? Because John's saying it's enough. Because if you're not going to believe with those, then you're not going to believe. You're not going to believe at all. So we have to stop and say, am I getting the message? Because if I'm not getting the message, then this will be the sign leading to heaven. You're not coming in. No entry. We've got to get the sign. And the sign should motivate us to dedicate ourselves to Jesus, to serving Him, working hard in His church, putting first the kingdom and His righteousness. That's when we're getting the sign.